what we have got here today is a presentation we've been working with folks over the last several months as we anticipate the rule. And we think that what we're seeing is, of course, the rule is coming out at the end of June. That's our best information. EPA continues to say so, despite some nagging concerns like the fact that it's not in front of OMB yet necessarily and all of that. So we think it's timely to start thinking about how the rule is going to play out, what it means for us now and in the months immediately following its publication. We're also seeing nationwide a lot more emphasis on evaluation of thermal limitations. In some cases, these are limitations that go back 40 or more years. And for various reasons, which we'll touch on briefly, we see a lot of reassessment of that. And we just thought, since we have a group like this together, it would pay to give you some of our observations, very brief preliminary observations, but we certainly are prepared to talk with any of you about this more if you're interested. So we'll do those two things in the next hour. By all means, let me know if you have a question. Just sing out. It's a small group, so we can have a pretty good dialogue. I also, just looking down the list of people that are signed in, it looks like everyone here is pretty much a Phase 2 kind of 316B rule person. If there is anyone that's interested in the non-Phase 2 schedule, we're certainly prepared to address questions on that, but the emphasis here is going to be Phase 2 facilities just because of that early schedule constraint and also because of the entrainment pieces. So as we sit here in early May of 13, certainly the final rule content is uncertain. We've had a lot of discussions with the agency, and I know you all have too. Based on past experience, the draft rule and the final rule have looked very different, Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. There's been major changes as they move from the proposal to the final. In this case, I think we have a higher level of information because of the ongoing dialogue between the industry and the EPA. And frankly, there's, I think, a good deal of political involvement as well in the form of the White House. But long story short, facilities that are covered are going to incur costs once the rule is final associated with development of compliance documents under 40 CFR 122.21. There'll be monitoring of some kind, likely. We hope not inevitably, but probably some. And I think under this rule, EPA is really trying to drive change at the majority of facilities. So I think as opposed to Phase 2, there's less of a chance that the status quo is going to suffice, particularly for impingement. So retrofits are, I think, a real possibility under this rule. The other thing that's, I think, very important here is that the approaches that we understand and anticipate for impingement and entrainment are likely to differ. They may occur on the same schedule, but philosophically they're very different. We'll talk about that. Based on the Notice of Data Availability from the summer of last year, we anticipate that EPA is likely to consider more impingement mortality compliance options, and that those options are hopefully going to be broadly less stringent, in particularly the 88% post-impingement survival. We hope we never hear of that again. That's all good news. Some aspects of the rule, as right now, appear unlikely to change, some aspects of the proposed rule, namely that there'll be a raft of reports under 40 CFR 122.21. We hear different things about the schedule for Phase 2 facilities. We've heard that reports will be due 6 months after, that the rule will become effective 60 days after publication. We've heard 90 days after publication. and then that the reports would be due 60 days after, or 6 months after that. We've also heard rumor that there's going to be more of a rolling schedule based on the NPDES permit renewal dates, like they did under Phase 2. Don't really know how that's going to play out. Bottom line is, I think the schedule is a real risk as published. We expect that entrainment mortality will continue to be addressed by a BPJ basis at the discretion of the NPDES director. That, I'm sure, is the single biggest reason that the enviro groups will plan to sue EPA. We hope that the impingement mortality will continue to not be a driver for retrofit to closed cycle cooling by itself. That was a very positive aspect of the proposal, and hopefully we're going to retain that. We also expect that the peer review requirement is going to stay in place. The EPA regional staff love it, and everything we've heard out of Washington is that it's going to stick. We believe generally that really strategy right out of the box is very important here. There are several aspects of implementation that are going to involve decisions, and those decisions should be made within the context of a very solid strategy. For example, selection of the compliance approach for impingement mortality. How do you weigh those different options, risks and benefits, and select one? What do you do to monitor? What are the goals of monitoring? What are your approaches for both impingement and potentially entrainment? How do you get at these secondary goals that were proposed for impingement, like entrapment and performance commensurate with barrier nets? If those are in the final rule, how are you going to deal with those? They're not going to be easy issues at several plants. What is the scope and approach to the entrainment reports? Those could be potentially extremely complicated reports. If you're sitting up here in the Northeast like I am, I think that you can expect words like non-use benefits to probably be part of the discussion with the agency. And understanding what your options are and working through that is going to be a very strategic exercise. Similar with the peer review process. EPA, for reasons that I don't understand, thinks that's going to be relatively simple. And we have seen quite the contrary in other contexts. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to try to manage that and try to keep it simple and keep the surprises down. So in general, the comprehensive strategy, we think, is part of minimizing the costs, improving the outcome on the process. Under the current rulemaking, I think we all had major concerns about the proposed rulemaking, particularly relative to the approaches for impingement. There were substantial industry comments, particularly on impingement, and I think EPA has really gotten that memo. I hope they have. As recently, right up until the current time, there's been a lot of meetings with the affected industry and trade groups with EPA and White House staff. I think this has been I understand, a lot of horse trading, a lot of dialogue on what the industry hopes for in the form of a final rule. In general, we understand that the communication with the environmental groups has been more limited. They certainly endorsed the willingness to pay approach, NOTA, last summer. They had very few comments on the impingement NOTA. And certainly EPA expects a lawsuit out of them. In the NOTAs from last summer, we saw some very positive suggestions for impingement. Lots of things could change, like de minimis. I'll talk about that in a minute. The stated preference survey, EPA variously has still continued to seem to back that. It has been presented to the National Research Council as a final element of a peer review or a technical review. I know that this is of great concern to the industry and beyond. people like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have weighed in. This would be viewed as a very bad precedent for the regulated community in a broad basis. So this is a graphic that we pulled together based on sort of a combination of the proposal and what we see coming forward in 2013 based on what we anticipate. And this has on two separate tracks the approach to impingement mortality and the approach to entrainment mortality. These may occur on the same timeline. Certainly the industry really was hoping that there would not be this sort of double jeopardy situation where you do something for impingement and then potentially reevaluate it under entrainment. But irregardless of the timeline, they're very different processes, it seems to us. And so as we start up at the top, as soon as the rule is published, we're going to review it, try to understand what the options are for both impingement and entrainment, map out what the rule needs, what those 122.21 reports require, and come up with an overall strategy. We're going to march down the impingement route by looking at the relative merits of the options that are presented to us. And then on an internal basis, you're probably going to make some bet on what you think the best measure or measures are to get there, either something simple like a retrofit with risk off, hopefully, or trying to bank on a bunch of measures that you're already doing that may add up to enough credit to satisfy the impingement mortality. You're going to need to develop a monitoring strategy in that first 6 months if the rule final looks like the published, and then document that in a plan. Certainly, we think that plan should have an adaptive management aspect to it. There's no firm final commitments in that plan, but just a set of additional measures to move through the process. Under the proposal for impingement, you would have been required to install no later than 8 years out. And then what we see as most sensible is if it's appropriate, following the installation of that measure, you monitor impingement performance. And that may take a variety of forms. Hopefully it's not in latent mortality. This is kind of how we expect impingement to play out. There are clearly a lot of details yet to be determined here, but I think at the end of the day, the expectation is that retrofits are relatively likely under this path, and we are going to try to de-emphasize impingement monitoring, rely on the old data that are available, unless there is some clear utility for it. On the other side, for entrainment, a little more wide open. In 6 months, we prepare a draft entrainment characterization plan. That gets subjected to peer review in the following 6 months. In a lot of ways, that could be a relatively simple plan. We'll talk some more about that. Then you either collect or hopefully just review existing entrainment data, and then you refine the strategies for the engineering and economic analyses that are required under reports 9 through 12, or 10 through 12 more properly. You prepare those analyses. They get subjected to a peer review. We would suggest that there's a work plan aspect to those 3 reports so that you're not spending money on peer review for reports that are already complete, but you at least get to understand their concerns before you spend a lot of money. Then you select options, if any, or defend the status quo, which would certainly be our preferred option. And then you present those to the agency. They review them under the proposed language at 125.98E, which is a little bit different than the criteria set out in 122.21, and that's worth pointing out. And then following agreement with the agency, either you install, or if you have to install new options, that's done under no set deadline under the proposal. So I go through this detail really just to suggest these are very there's a lot of differences between these two approaches, even if they're synchronized in time. So just to spend a little more time on the impingement mortality requirements. I mentioned this earlier, some changes under consideration in the NOTA. We hope to see a lot more emphasis on the pre-approved technologies. The industry really emphasized modified traveling screens, wrist trough and a fish return, closed cycle cooling, and velocity caps, as well as half foot per second. Those were all proposals floated by the industry as good candidates for pre-approval, which hopefully means that you install them, you operate them, and you're finished. There's not a biological performance. That's our hope. There was a lot of discussion in the NOTA about crediting existing reductions. It sounded a lot like a return to the calculation baseline. Our concern with that option as expressed is EPA seems to be hung up on a very high rate of impingement reduction, something like 90%, which is going to be very hard for a lot of facilities to get to. And so the extent of biological monitoring there is a real wild card. Alternative impingement limits or approaches to account for fragile species were discussed. An emphasis on biological performance standards only applicable to species of concern. That was a big comment from the regulator community on the proposal. I think we're likely to see a de minimis exemption of some kind. I've heard 1,000 fish per year as a de minimis number. I'm hopeful there's a little more flexibility than that. And then the potential for a site-specific BTA based on infeasibility or a cost-to-benefit ratio was discussed. For the impingement requirements, again, if these pre-approved technologies are properly stated, that would be, I think, a fairly positive outcome on the rulemaking. It would cost some money, but hopefully it would be a clear path to compliance at a lot of these facilities. Achieving compliance with the other technologies, as I mentioned, appears likely to be based on achieving a numerical standard for either impingement reductions or impingement mortality reductions. This is likely to be more challenging and complicated, and in my mind would almost certainly trigger some sort of monitoring effort. The inclusion of these cost-benefit tests, the de minimis and other flexibility is less certain, depending upon which one we talk about. And we really hope that these secondary requirements for facilities on tidal waters to reduce impingement mortality for shellfish, commensurate with a barrier net, and to avoid entrapment in an intake canal, we really hope those go away, because those could be very, very difficult and get us into some operational issues, among other things that are difficult. So in 6 months, at least that's what we understand, or that's what was proposed, we have to do a preliminary selection of the compliance measure for impingement under 122.21R6. And as I mentioned, we want to craft this report to provide flexibility, include some conditional outs from the commitments. Basically, as more data become available, as circumstances change, you want to just be able to maintain some flexibility, particularly if you're collecting more data, doing more engineering assessment. On that issue, we think it's probably going to be useful to engage the agency and have discussions like that so they're prepared to see that kind of language. And the critical considerations here are how exactly do the rules options and any flexibility, how do they apply at the facility given the geometry and the setup and the source water and all of that, and how do the feasibility, costs, and effectiveness stack up at the facility? Do you have extreme cold weather, which would make a fish return more challenging? Things as basic as that really need to be appraised, at least preliminarily, before that report goes in. So we are going to look at issues like site-specific feasibility, site-specific costs, including capital, O&M, lost revenue, the probability of achieving and maintaining rule compliance based on the parameters set out in the final rule, how reliable is the system to operate, and how reliably will it perform biologically, any operational impacts on the facility, what implications there are for a monitoring program and how tightly tied your compliance would be to monitoring, and as well as other adverse impacts. All of these should be brought to the technology assessment in that first 6 months. What we're clearly recommending here, especially for those of you with Phase 2 facilities, is that you build on your historical efforts. I know several of you have done assessments of technologies. We think it's going to make sense, again, to screen the alternatives rather broadly using simple, low-cost methods. Certainly, we've used these tools, in some cases for some of you that are on the phone, using simple, transparent tools that try to get at these site-specific factors, costs, feasibility, and the like. It's really more of a conceptual approach, but we have found it to be very credible, and it has the great advantage of being basically doable in the time frame without spending a lot of engineering cost. It's likely after the 6-month window that you're going to spend more detailed review on more promising technologies. Just hypothetically, you may need to spend some real engineering dollars looking at wrist-off retrofits, dual flow screens, fish return systems, and the like to satisfy yourself and the agency that you're on the right path. Documenting the basis of selection using these screening tools is likely to be helpful, both internally and with the agency that's reviewing what you're proposing. The impingement monitoring that was proposed in the rule was really a mess. Depending upon where you read in the 40 CFR portion, the rule requirements were vague. Sometimes they contradicted each other. Sometimes they simply didn't make a lot of sense within the context of the proposal. We certainly see the costs here as being high, particularly if you have to do latent mortality monitoring. And we think it's an open question what these data are going to be used for. Are you simply going to enumerate rates of impingement? Are you going to do something where you're trying to get at the species so that you can do design support? Or are you going to try to understand how you're going to use impingement to define compliance? Those are very different goals that have different methods and strategies. And that's clearly what we want to bring to that 6-month report, is make sure the data you're proposing lines up with what you think needs to be done. So in general, we were after a flexible, minimal cost sampling effort, only the data that are useful. I think in a lot of cases, there's going to be agencies that think they need to see some impingement data just to understand the rates. And in that case, the Phase 2 data ought to do just fine, I think. And we need to think about minimizing the sampling frequency to focus on the issues at hand. And certainly, under Phase 2, a lot of what we talked about with the agencies is methods, frequency, gear type, all that stuff. Our recommendation is let's not have those discussions again if we don't need to, and use the precedent that's available to us. Switching gears to the entrainment aspect, we have a pretty good expectation that this is likely to be similar to what was proposed in 2011. This is potentially complicated, and this is really where the high stakes reside for several facilities. There's several important differences from the Phase 2 rule. There's no exemption for intakes on large rivers. even though it seems to us that that's a very important mitigation aspect. If you're taking a small portion of river flow, that seems to me that's going to minimize your biological effect, and that should be maintained front and center. Inclusion in this aspect of the rule was proposed to be triggered on actual intake flow, AIF, greater than 125 MGD, and that was defined in the proposal in a fairly positive way for the industry, and and based on the NOTA, I think might still be. Things like you get to credit zero flow non-operational days toward that 125 MGD. So a lot of plants that have low capacity factors may be able to come in well below that 125. And that's certainly something we're recommending to our clients. They understand plant by plant. The economic analysis here is critical. It's potentially very complicated, and it's much less defined than under Phase 2. Under Phase 2, you were told how to discount everything and over what period to amortize and all that. This is much more wide open. There's a potential for all kinds of different impacts, both positive and negative, to be monetized and totaled. And I think understanding that and working with it on a site-specific basis for what's appropriate is really the message we'd leave you with. The potential for stated preference results to be part of this is a major question mark. EPA has, in statements to us at points, they've said there's no way that would be applicable on a site-specific basis, and then the same individuals 2 months later have said that seemed perfectly reasonable to them. So that's something just to be aware of, because certainly it'll be costly, and it has the potential to really inflate the perception of monetized benefits. And the peer review, I think, is an important aspect of this, and as I mentioned, needs to be managed. So there are 4 reports that serve as the basis for documenting the information to the NPDES agency. Entrainment characterization study, which is essentially the rates of entrainment. The comprehensive technical feasibility and cost evaluation study, that is an evaluation of ways of mitigating it. Under the proposal, you were required to look at closed cycle cooling as well as fine mesh panels on traveling screens. The benefit valuation study, where you translate the reductions in entrainment into monetized benefits, and then the non-water quality and other adverse environmental impact study looks at things like salt drift and increased or decreased efficiency, things like that, increased heat rate. Just to mention again that the criteria laid out for the agency to evaluate what is BTA for entrainment differ from 122.21. So considering a brief separate synthesis report is probably a good idea. And as we look at these reports, we really have 2 goals. One is to make sure that we submit the requirements on time and consistent with the rule, so that you don't have a non-compliance situation. But more fundamentally, we want to reduce or eliminate the chance of closed cycle cooling being selected as BTA by the agency. And that's really where we're going to be. So for entrainment, we look at each plant, we look at each jurisdiction, and make a calculation, how much do we need to invest here to keep closed cycle cooling off the table. Certainly EPA perceives that some states are going to be more willing to eliminate closed cycle cooling than others, and we want to tailor the efforts to that and make an appropriate choice. Things like estimating the cost-to-benefit ratio of closed cycle cooling based on simple plant-specific considerations may help inform that. Understanding what EPA did in the final rule to justify the rule in terms of a cost-to-benefit ratio, that will be helpful and should be considered. The stated position of your NPDES director if there's any. All that sort of goes into this. And I mentioned peer review. Certainly the resource economists that we've talked to are very concerned about the peer review. Frankly, they are sort of getting excited that they think a very high level of sophistication is necessary to stand up to the peer review. We don't necessarily agree with that, but certainly we need to probably engage those peer reviewers early and make them part of the process so there's no ugly surprises. Entrainment monitoring. Again, the agencies may be just fundamentally interested in having these rates enumerated, and it's not clear to me that they need to do that. What it seems to us that the entrainment rates are used for is as a driver for estimating the monetized benefits of any control measures. So if you have entrainment data, it seems to me, and it's relatively current, say phase 2, it seems to me that you've got a good data set with which to do that. Certainly the rule could come out and simply state that entrainment monitoring is necessary in the future. That's conceivable, and we just need to look for things like that, and we need to look for things like statement about the frequency and duration of monitoring. Again, we want to limit the scope to the extent possible, collect data only with utility, use the historical results, and in many cases supplement with literature studies on the source waters that may help provide things like ichthyoplankton densities. They may provide periods of recruitment that allow us to limit the sampling period. Just a note on latent mortality following entrainment or mortality following entrainment. The utility of this potentially is you can demonstrate that some high proportion of organisms survive, and that would lower the monetized benefit of closed cycle cooling. That sounds pretty positive. Of course, the agencies haven't got a great track record of accepting the validity of that data. And in fact, under phase 2, they made a very clear statement that they thought 100% mortality was the best sense of the literature at that time. So it's something that we're a little skeptical is going to be very useful. And certainly there are folks out there that have done a lot of this work, particularly up here in the Northeast. There's a history of doing it back in the 70s. And at least one commenter among the industry groups thought that an annual program for entrainment mortality might cost close to $1 million a year to execute. The methods are controversial. There may be other ways of getting at this, like bringing the literature to bear or looking at the proportion of dead organisms that come into the intake and discounting them. That may be simpler because you're not having to look at their latency. You can count them immediately as dead. That may be a simpler way to get at the same issue. But fundamentally, assuming 100% mortality may not change the cost-benefit ratio by very much. It may only change it by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4, which may not make much of a difference at your facility. So this should be really carefully weighed. Some of these other reports, there are several, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 8, that are relatively straightforward. They look essentially the same as what was prepared under phase 2. So those of you that certainly prepared proposals for information collection or impingement mortality and entrainment characterization studies, or in some cases submitted these reports, you probably have a really good place to start. And that's certainly what we would counsel is you start with those existing materials, develop simple, concise reports on a standardized basis, make sure that you're engaging the relevant stakeholders among plant operators and get the data you need. and institute careful QA, QC, and document storage and retention measures. So as we sit here about a month and a half before the rule is released, 2 months before the rule is released, our recommendation at this point to our clients is consolidate those historical reports and data, understand what's available. It's certainly possible to do a gap analysis relative to these 122.21 reports, understand where you have impingement data, entrainment data, understand what your existing structures may be doing to mitigate impingement or entrainment, or your operational measures might be doing. Get a sense of what you might be able to defend among the status quo situation, particularly relative to these pre-approved technologies. I think it pays to start understanding the economic analyses and the engineering assessment. Several of you have seen flyers from us over the last few months. We're about to produce another one on the resource economic pieces. We'll get that out to you, and by all means, if you have questions, let me know. Planning for the peer review process, I think it's not too early for that, and including engaging the agency. Identifying the internal team. I'm sure most of you have already done this, where you have a working group within the organization to start anticipating this. Certainly we see people moving, engaging consultants like ourselves. That's probably prudent at this point, at least start having the discussions. Can't say enough about how to plan your July and August of this year. Understanding fundamentally if that 6-month window is going to be what is proposed is going to be really important, especially for people with a large fleet. And then once that's understood, getting a strategy for developing the reports and then developing the strategy for compliance is probably is very important to plan for that this late summer. In several states, you're dealing with ongoing state review on a best professional judgment basis, and or you're looking at thermal evaluations at the same time. Considering coordination of that, I think, is a really good idea. Agency engagement. We've started to do this with several of our clients, not only with the NPDES agency, but also the resource agency. And that's important, I think, because rule implementation is really going to vary. Again, many agencies and permit writers have limited expertise in the rule or with cooling water intake structure evaluation at all. The rule will very likely have flexibility, vagaries, and inconsistencies, and we need to understand those and deal with the risks and opportunities as they arise. Advocating for reasonable and workable interpretations of things like the approach to the peer review, the definition of where the half-foot per second standard applies within the context of your intake, the things like these secondary barrier net requirements, getting some opinion on the record about how important that might be, identifying species of concern, talking about periods of recruitment. All of these are probably not, they're pretty low cost, but could be really useful at setting the stage for the rule implementation. And certainly we want to understand what their hot button issues are. If they're concerned about something, we certainly want to build that into our strategy. There's a list of things, and you'll see this as I send the presentation to you. These are questions that we think are going to be really critical as the rule comes out. There's about 3 or 4 pages here where, none of these is rocket science, but we put this together just for ourselves to organize our own thinking. Things as fundamental as what is the schedule? What's due when? How are impingement and entrainment coordinated? How are they monitored? How how do the thresholds, how are they calculated, how do they apply at your facility, what are the elements of the pre-approved technology? All of these questions are clearly important and will really be the focus that we bring to the review of the rule. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with these. I'll just click through them and leave that to your review when you see the presentation. But certainly we can return to them during the question and answer. So just transitioning a little bit into the more blatant sales piece here. ECT's approach, several of you are aware, the staff that we have here today have traditionally offered a full range of services. We're prepared to basically do the biological assessment, the technology assessment, certainly the strategy and project management, but we also have and continue to team with specialists, be they engineers or local biologists or resource economists. We're very practiced at working within client teams, and that includes several representatives within the client organization, as well as other contractors. That's something we're very comfortable with. We've been very active in the rule in the last 2 years. We prepared comments on the draft and the notice for several clients, and we've met with EPA. At the end of the day, we appreciate that this is a multidisciplinary problem. You're really trying to get at the intersection between the regulation, the engineering, and the biology. And it's going to take variously those three disciplines to come together. And our approach is to get to the cost-effective compliance, be that whether we have to emphasize economics at one site or biological monitoring at another. That's always what we're after, is cost-effective compliance. This is a matrix of some of our current staff experience. This is largely staff experience, so a lot of us bring this from other companies, but we're pretty proud of what we've been able to do under 316B, as well as thermal, and we've worked in a lot of states. Just quickly, I want to touch on the trends we see on the thermal limitations nationwide. In some ways, I think this has more risk for some people than even the 316B side does. What we see nationally is that the states are changing their water quality standards. Not all of them, but many of them. Things like in Region 5, where essentially all the states now have seasonally varying maximum temperatures. Some states they've changed as often as every 2 weeks. Many states are reevaluating how they define mixing zones, and it's generally not a positive reevaluation for the industry. We're dealing with a situation where ambient temperatures have been consistently above the water quality standards, particularly in regions 5, 7, 8, and 6 last year. Those led to some emergency variances from the standards for dischargers. There's an invitation, or actually a requirement under the proposed 316B rule to consider thermal issues, thermal discharge issues, as part of the entrainment BTA assessment. We see several national and regional initiatives. Nationally, the permit quality reviews are happening for major power plants. Certainly, regions 4, 5, and 6 are systematically revisiting variances, and they're each doing it in a little bit different way, but it's not a real positive thing for us at this point either way. And so the result of all of this is there's more focus on the thermal conditions during the permit renewal, thermal limitations. Added to that, we have different approaches to the thermal limits available to us, things like mixing zones, there's grandfathering provisions at some plants, there's thermal variances, some states have special status waters, and all of that varies depending upon the state and their specific rules and standards. Another thing that we see is many of the variances originally issued in the 1970s were issued by EPA prior to the states receiving NPDES delegation. So there's states out there that have been carrying variances in their NPDES permits for years, but have never reviewed and approved a 316A variance study. And so the new emphasis on justification for renewal may be their first review of 316 situation. And I can think of several states right off the bat where this is the case. The other thing that we're seeing is that the EPA memory on these issues has really diminished as staff has retired and as records have been lost by the agency. So some of these very extensive, very useful studies that were done in the 70s and 80s, they probably only reside in your records. They may not be at the agency anymore at all. And so that leaves the states uncertain on how to proceed when they get pressure from EPA to reevaluate a thermal limitation. And I mentioned that EPA regions are driving the assessment. There is a permit quality review that occurs at headquarters for major permits in this SIC code, for the Power SIC code. This seems to us to be driven by this Region 4 situation where in North Carolina, the EPA Inspector General had an adverse audit of Region 4 when they were doing new permit reviews. The Inspector General found that there was insufficient information to support a variance reissuance, and there was limited public opportunity to review and comment on the proposed variance. In a lot of ways, that sounds like a bunch of procedural flaws, and that's the way the Inspector General report reads, honestly. But what it's done is it's caused, particularly Region 4 in this case, to really change the way they're looking at variances. And we've seen a lot, we're working for several people that essentially have been told to redo their variance studies. And what we are trying to do, of course, is avoid that. And so far we've had some success. So our recommendation relative to thermal essentially is be aware of the trends, be aware of what's going on in the region, the state, and nationally, at least to be sensitive to that the thermal limits might be a problem. Understand the basis of your thermal limits, particularly if you have a 316A variance, be sure to request its renewal. Without a request to renew, it can be dropped, and it's going to be exceedingly difficult to get back. You know, I say this, there are states out there who don't fully understand that a variance is the basis of some of these permit limits. Understand the options to support your limits. Understand the previous studies and determinations and be able to bring them back to the table to say this was why EPA or the state determined what they determined. Understand the terms like absence of prior appreciable harm. Understand the reference area approach. These are terms that come out of the draft 316A guidance from 1977, and I think a lot of people are seeing these terms for the first time as they get new permit conditions. If you've already documented that the balanced indigenous population is protected, you may be in a position to just demonstrate that balanced indigenous population has not changed since the original variance. That's something that so far we've been pretty successful with, and that's a more modest study potentially and a less risky one. If a field effort is necessary, scope it very carefully, build on the existing findings, be consistent with the regulatory goals, and use those regulatory goals in your plan. Use the language you need to use, and do anything to explore the alternatives to doing the full 6-taxa thermal model kind of approach that some people think the 316A guidance requires.